Well, as the Bernie Sanders campaign gains momentum, one of his chief campaign surrogates is, of course, the irrepressible Ilhan Omar, a Democrat from Minnesota. She's awful in every way. She's obviously an open anti-Semite. She had a tweet just in the last 24 hours that was getting all sorts of attention, in which she labeled herself everything except American, which was really entertaining. She said, "I am hijabi, Muslim, black, foreign-born, refugee, Somali," easily triggering conservatives, right-wing bloggers, anti-Muslim bigots, tinfoil conspiracy theorists, birthers, pay me $1 to bash Muslim fraudsters, pro-occupation groups, and every single xenophobe since 2016. What a heroine she is. Just so much heroism. Joining us on the line to discuss Ilhan Omar and who exactly she is Ben Weingarten. He's a senior contributor at the Federalist, fellow of the Claremont Institute, in 2019 recipient of the Fund for American Studies Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship. He also has a brand new book, American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar and the Progressive-Islamist Takeover of the Democratic Party. Ben, great to talk to you, sir.
Ben, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
You bet. So let's start with exactly who is Ilhan Omar and where did she come from? So the first most of us glanced of her was she was suddenly appearing on the cover of Rolling Stone with Nancy Pelosi, or she was in the news saying anti-Semitic things. What exactly is Ilhan Omar's backstory?
The background of Ilhan Omar is really fascinating, and of course, like so much in her background, completely unexplored. The media has no interest in delving into where she comes from, who her influences were, what her family members did. And I think the most amazing thing about her story is actually that she holds these views. She describes herself as an intersectional feminist. She's obsessed with identity politics. She sort of personifies the perfect multiculturalist leftist milieu. And she could have picked up those views as easily in the enclave in which she grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as in the Somalia of her birth. And I think it really bears noting, incidentally, that no one has really ever talked about her family influences, even though she talks about quite frequently the influence of her father and grandfather on her own political course. And they were both members of the government. Her father called a teacher's teacher within the Somali regime, and her grandfather has been able to director of marine transport there. And that regime was a Marxist Islamist dictatorship. And that is not Ben Weingarten talking. That's actually how the New York Times described it, and how Siad Barre, the dictator who ruled Somalia, under which her family prospered, how he himself described it.
So with that background, when did she come to the United States? Under what circumstances did her family come to the United States? And obviously now how her family came is also becoming more and more of an issue in Minnesota, with apparently ongoing investigations into her and her brother and all of this.
Yeah, she came over with her father and a sister as well in the early 90s, originally to Virginia, and then they resettled in the Minneapolis area, where there's a very large enclave with tens of thousands of Somali refugees who were resettled there. And again, it's quite interesting. No one has really done the digging, delved into what her father was doing there. But the reality is, as a teacher, and as many other teachers that she has cited, formed her kind of family background there and influenced her. A teacher in a Marxist Islamist regime, Soviet-backed, was themselves inculcated in the ruling Communist Party ideology of the Soviet Union. Again, it was a Marxist Islamist dictatorship itself. And the fact that no one is even curious about what influence her family members had on her is quite interesting, as is the fact that by her own admission, she was privileged to use her own party's parlance in Somalia, rather, before she went to a refugee camp in Kenya. She lived in a compound. There were beggars outside. Her family would feed those beggars. She talks about a house filled with books and the like, just this wonderful paradise-like experience in, again, a Marxist Islamist dictatorship. She comes to the U.S., and again, what's amazing about her district is that her district, which consisted largely, and this is as a state representative, her district, which consisted largely of Somali refugees, also consisted as well of 2 college campuses. And it was actually those college students who pushed her over the top in helping her topple a 44-year incumbent in Minnesota State House to ascend to be a state representative, and then shortly thereafter, a member of the U.S. House as well. And I mentioned Obama before, and the parallel is interestingly that she was also a community organizer. She talked about the fact that her parents told her to organize for what she wanted to achieve in the U.S., her brand of justice, which of course is antithetical to the justice that you and I believe in.
So what exactly are her values? So we've seen, obviously, she's a religious Muslim, she wears hijab, but she also stands in favor of abortion on demand, many policies that presumably run against a lot of the social teachings of Islam. I mean, she stands foursquare in favor of some of the most radical social elements of the leftist agenda. So how does all of that square? How does that fit together?
Yeah, and what I argue in the book is that she sort of personifies the unholy alliance between the left and Islamists. And I had Andy McCarthy write the foreword to this book. He wrote the book, The Grand Jihad, where he talked about sort of how these two sides reconcile their seemingly antithetical views on social issues and a whole number of issues, a whole number of other issues. And I think really the simplest answer here is that they are able to set aside their differences because it is Judeo-Christian Western civilization that stands in the way of both of their paths to conquest for power. Obviously, the worldview of the progressives flouts completely the ideals, principles, values, institutions of our founding. And of course, we know that Islamic supremacist ideology is inherently expansionist, totalitarian, cannot brook any sort of dissent. So in this regard, they're both totalitarian belief systems, and the stumbling block to those totalitarian belief systems is best represented in America. And so if you believe that America is inherently evil, it's a stumbling block to your system, as Ilhan Omar has argued, and she basically has called us in far harsher terms, deplorable, irredeemable, ignorant, and the like, then naturally justice demands that you overturn that system. And so what I argue in the book, and I go back and look at the historical roots of both the Jew hatred among socialists and on the left, and the Jew hatred that has predominated in the Islamic world for centuries, they have come together really in the last 50 plus years, and it was in the Soviet Union and the Middle East, a very deeply intertwined alliance there against the West, which they would call, the capitalist, imperialist, oppressor West. And Ilhan Omar is sort of the modern instantiation of that belief system value and ultimately their goal of toppling us.
We're speaking with Ben Weingarten. His new book is American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar and the Progressive-Islamist Takeover of the Democratic Party. Obviously, Bernie Sanders has drawn from the same pool as Ilhan Omar in terms of ideology in many ways, and this has led to the bizarre spectacle of a man who keeps proclaiming his own Jewish roots, campaigning with open anti-Semites. I mean, she's openly anti-Semitic. So is Rashida Tlaib. So, of course, is Linda Sarsour. So I've said before that Ilhan Omar is anti-Semitic. I'm sure you talk about in the book American Ingrate what exactly her relationship is with anti-Semitism. When I say she's anti-Semitic, sometimes you get blowback. People suggest, she's not anti-Semitic. She's just anti-Israel. What do you make of that critique?
Yeah, well, let me just say, first of all, on the Bernie Sanders point, that it's really important to note that she was named the co-chair of his campaign in Minnesota, which is a pivotal state in 2020. So this isn't some bit player. This is actually a very substantial player in the Democratic Party today. And also, with respect to Bernie Sanders labeling himself now embracing his Jewish identity, where before he completely ignored it, essentially, he has basically described his Jewish identity as leftism. And that speaks for itself, stands for itself. And I would argue that that is not actually what the religion stands for. In any event, in terms of the whole anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism thing, not only does Ilhan Omar surround herself with people who attack Jews qua Jews, not just the Jewish state as the collective Jew. What I argue is that in reality, what that Jew hatred comes down to is a hatred of Jews and the Jewish state as representative of and a bulwark for Judeo-Christian Western civilization. And so the Jew hatred itself goes beyond just Jews to all of us, everyone in America who believes in our founding values, traditions, and principles. And I go in great detail in the book to show that she actually checks off every single box of Natan Sharansky's 3D definition of what anti-Semitism is, what the State Department definition of anti-Semitism is, what the broadly recognized international definition of anti-Semitism is. But again, it's Jew hatred as a stand-in for hatred of us, hatred of all Americans.
Well, the book is American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar and the Progressive-Islamist Takeover of the Democratic Party. The author is Ben Weingarten. Ben, really appreciate your time. And folks, you can go get the book at Amazon.com or wherever books are sold. Really appreciate it, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it.